The bone was longer than the forearm of the man who pulled it out of the ground. In the late summer of 1919, a work crew was cutting a drainage ditch through farmland outside a quiet county in the American Midwest, the kind of place where nothing happens and everyone prefers it that way. They were digging through heavy river clay, the sort that grabs a shovel and refuses to let go, when one of the men struck something that rang differently, not the dull thud of a stone, not the soft give of a buried root, something dense, something that had been down there a very long time. They cleared the mud away by hand, and what they lifted out did not make sense. It was a femur, a human thigh bone, except no man alive stands tall enough to carry a bone that size. Held up against the leg of the tallest worker on the crew, it ran from his ankle almost to his hip. The men stopped digging. Someone went to fetch the foreman. The foreman went for the town doctor. And within a week, word had spread far enough that men in dark suits stepped off a train from the east, packed the bones into wooden crates, and carried them away. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The crates were addressed to a single institution, the Smithsonian, and that, according to the people who were there, is the last anyone ever saw of them. Now, you have probably heard a version of this story before. A ditch, a mound, a farmer's field, and a giant skeleton that ends up in a crate bound for Washington and is never heard from again. It sounds like a campfire tale, something a grandfather invents to keep the children quiet on a long night. And for most of the last century, that is exactly how it has been treated. A folk story, a hoax, a trick of the light on some old cow bones and a slow news day. But here is the part that keeps people up at night. The 1919 dig is not the only one. It is one of hundreds. And when you lay them all out, side by side, decade by decade, a pattern appears that becomes very difficult to explain away. The same discovery, in different states, in different years, told by different people who never met each other. A giant is found. The newspapers report it. Experts are summoned, the remains are shipped east to the same address, and then the trail goes cold, every single time. So the question this video is really about is not whether one femur in one ditch was real. The question is bigger and stranger. Why does the same thing keep happening? And who benefits from a world where these bones simply cease to exist? To answer that, we have to go back further than 1919. We have to understand what the ground in America was already full of long before that crew ever picked up a shovel. Because for most of the 1800s, the United States had a mystery buried right under its feet, and almost nobody talks about it anymore. They were called the mounds. All across the Ohio Valley, down through the Mississippi Basin, into the Carolinas, and up into the Great Lakes, the early settlers kept running into enormous earthworks, not natural hills, structures. Some were shaped like animals half a mile long. Some were flat-top pyramids the size of a city block, and some were burial mounds, tall as a barn, packed with human remains. There were tens of thousands of them. One survey in the 1800s counted more than 10,000 mounds in a single state alone. When farmers ploughed these mounds flat to plant their crops, they found things inside: copper ornaments, sheets of hammered silver, pottery painted with symbols nobody could read, and bones. A great many bones. Most were ordinary. But the accounts that survive, printed in local papers of the period, describe again and again a specific and unsettling detail. Some of the skeletons were huge, jaws that fit over a living man's face with room to spare, rows of double teeth, top and bottom, skulls with heavy, shelf-like brows, and leg bones that suggested people who stood 7, 8, even 9 feet tall. Now, you can dismiss any one of these reports. Country papers of the 1800s printed sea serpents and moon men too. Editors were not above inventing a story to sell copies. But that is exactly why the pattern matters. It is easy to fake one story. It is much harder to explain why the same very specific detail, oversized jaws, double rows of teeth, giant femurs, shows up in hundreds of separate accounts, written by people who had no way of coordinating, spread across a century and an entire continent. And it was not only newspapermen making these claims, it was doctors, county officials, land surveyors, men whose reputations depended on not looking foolish. They measured what they found and they wrote it down, plainly, the way you would record a rainfall or a harvest yield. So the young country had a genuine puzzle on its hands. Who built the mounds? Where did they go? And why did so many of the dead inside them tower over the men digging them up? This is where our institution enters the story. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846, with money left to the United States by an Englishman named James Smithson, a man who, strangely enough, never once set foot in America. His will directed that his fortune go toward an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, and for the next several decades, the Smithsonian became exactly that, the official brain of the nation. If something was dug up, discovered, or disputed, it went to the Smithsonian to be studied and settled. In 1879, the institution created a special division to deal with the mound mystery once and for all. It was called the Bureau of Ethnology. Its job was to send trained men out into the field, excavate the mounds systematically, and produce a final answer about who had built them. And in 1894, the Bureau delivered that answer in a report thousands of pages long. Its conclusion was firm and simple. The mounds were built by the ancestors of Native American peoples. There was no lost race. There were no giants. Case closed. For mainstream history, that report ended the argument, and it has stayed ended for well over a century. But if you actually read the older accounts, the ones from before the official verdict was handed down, you notice something strange. Many of them describe remains that the final report simply does not mention. The oversized skeletons appear in the field notes, in the private letters, in the newspapers of the very towns where the digs happened. And then, by the time the polished official version is printed and bound, they are gone, not explained, not debunked, just absent. But before we follow those crates east, it is worth stopping on a colder question. Not what was found in the mounds, but who profited from the official answer. Because the mound mystery was never really about bones, it was about land. And in that century, land was everything. Think about the position the young nation was in. It was expanding westward across a continent that was already occupied, already farmed, already covered in the earthworks of people who had clearly been there for a very long time. That is an awkward fact for a government trying to justify taking the ground. So, for decades, the popular story was that the mounds had been built by some vanished superior race, a lost civilization wiped out long ago, and that the peoples living there now were merely latecomers squatting on someone else's ruins. It was a myth. But it was a convenient myth, because if the current inhabitants were not the true builders, then their claim to the land was weaker, and the taking of it looked less like theft. Then the official verdict flipped the story. There was no lost race. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the people already living there. Case closed, cleanly, tidily, with a single authority stamping the record. And notice what both versions have in common. In each one, the people writing the history are the same people drawing the property lines. History, at that scale, is not a neutral record of the past. It is a ledger of who is allowed to own what, who counts as first, and whose deed is valid. Whoever holds the pen holds the boundary line. And a 9-foot skeleton that does not fit either official story is not just an oddity. It is a loose thread hanging off a very expensive garment. The kind of thread that, if pulled, could unravel who really owns the ground under your feet. That is the frame to keep in your head as we go on. Every time evidence goes missing in this story, ask the old question the account books never print. Who benefits? Let me tell you about a few of these cases, because the details are where this gets genuinely hard to shrug off. Start with a place called Lovelock Cave, out in the Nevada desert. In the early 1900s, a mining company began hauling guano out of a cave for fertilizer. Bat droppings, essentially, worth good money at the time. But as the miners dug deeper into the floor of that cave, they started turning up artifacts, sandals, baskets woven with astonishing skill, weapons, human remains. And among those remains, according to the men who were there, were skeletons far larger than they should have been, some with reddish hair still clinging to the skull. The local tribe, the Paiute, already had an old story about that region. They spoke of a fierce, red-haired people who once lived in the area. Enemies their ancestors finally trapped inside a cave and drove out with fire. For generations, that was dismissed as pure legend, and then miners walked into a cave in the exact area described and started pulling out large bones and red hair. Some of the Lovelock material survives in museums today. Whether it proves anything about giants depends entirely on who is doing the measuring, and that argument has never fully died. Then there is the strangest one of all. In 1909, a newspaper in Arizona ran a front-page story claiming that Smithsonian-funded explorers had discovered an enormous underground complex inside the Grand Canyon. A network of tunnels and chambers, they wrote, filled with artifacts that looked distinctly Egyptian or Asian in origin, along with mummified remains of unusual size. The story named the men involved. It described the location in detail. It read exactly like a real archaeological bulletin of the era, and then it vanished. No follow-up, no confirmation. The Smithsonian, to this day, states plainly that it has no record of the expedition, no record of the men named, and no cavern matching the description. Skeptics say that settles it. It was a hoax, a bit of newspaper fiction to move papers on a slow week. Believers point out that a flat denial is not the same thing as an explanation, and that the section of the Grand Canyon the article described happens to be a restricted area to this day, with old maps of the canyon carrying place names like Isis Temple and Tower of Ra. Names, they ask. That came from where, exactly? I am not telling you the Grand Canyon story is true. I am telling you it fits the pattern with uncomfortable precision. A discovery, a specific, detailed claim, a rush of attention, and then a wall of official silence that neither proves nor disproves anything and leaves the whole thing hanging in the air forever. Move to upstate New York, a few decades earlier. A crew leveling a hill for a road cut into what turned out to be a burial chamber lined with flat stones. Inside, laid out with obvious care, were skeletons that the local paper described as belonging to men of gigantic stature, along with copper implements and beads. A professor was sent for. Measurements were taken, and the account, printed with the confidence of established fact, gives the height of the largest as well, over 7 feet. The bones were gathered up for preservation and study, and then, in the record that comes afterward, there is nothing, no display, no catalogue entry, no follow-up article correcting the earlier one. The story simply stops, mid-sentence, the way these stories always seem to stop. What makes the New York case worth pausing on is how ordinary the reporting is. There is no breathless language, no talk of monsters or lost races. It reads like a man recording a fact he expected to be believed, because in his world it was not yet controversial. The controversy came later, applied backward, once the official position had hardened into place. It is easy to forget that these accounts were written by people who did not yet know what the correct answer was supposed to be. Case after case follows the same shape. A mound in Wisconsin yields tall skeletons that reporters describe in careful detail, and the bones are sent away for study and never catalogued. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. A burial site in West Virginia opens up to reveal remains of remarkable size, measured and recorded by the excavators, and the record afterward goes quiet. In one account after another, the same 3 acts play out: the finding, the shipping east, the silence. And here is the detail that turns a curiosity into something colder. Almost none of these remains can be produced today. You would think that in the largest collection of artifacts on the planet, tens of millions of objects held by the Smithsonian, at least a few of these giant skeletons would be sitting in a drawer somewhere, tagged and shelved and waiting. Instead, the institution's position is essentially that these finds were never genuine to begin with, and so there is nothing to display. The bones that were real were ordinary. The giant ones were mistakes, exaggerations, or outright frauds. Maybe that is the honest truth. Bones get miscounted. Excited farmers overestimate. Newspapers embellish. It happens all the time. But sit with the alternative for a moment, because it is the whole reason this story refuses to die. What if the reason you cannot find the giants in the museum is not that they were never real, but that someone decided, very deliberately, that the public was better off never knowing they existed at all? And that is where this stops being a story about old bones and becomes something much larger. Because if you can accept, even as a possibility, that a central authority quietly removed a category of evidence that did not fit the accepted story, then you have to ask a much harder question. What else got removed? And what story, exactly, were they protecting? This is the doorway into one of the strangest ideas circulating today. Its followers call it Tartaria. The name comes from old maps. If you pull up European maps from the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, you will find, stretched across the whole of northern and central Asia, a vast labelled territory called Tartary, or Grand Tartary. On some maps it is one of the largest political regions on Earth. And then, over the course of the 1800s, it quietly disappears from the maps. The land is still there, obviously, but the name, the borders, the sense of a single great civilization, all of it fades out and gets carved up into the countries we recognize today. Mainstream historians have a straightforward explanation. Tartary was never a unified empire. It was a loose European catch-all term for a huge region full of many different peoples that outsiders did not understand well and simply lumped together under one convenient name. As geographic knowledge improved, the vague label was replaced by accurate ones. Nothing was erased. The map simply got better. The Tartaria theory says something far more provocative. It says there really was a single advanced civilization, global in its reach, sophisticated beyond what we credit for that era, and that it was deliberately written out of history, not just off the maps, but out of the textbooks, out of the museums, and out of the ground. The giants, in this telling, are not a separate mystery at all. They are part of the same missing chapter, an older, larger world that was scrubbed from the record and replaced with the tidy timeline we were all handed in a classroom. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where the topic gets genuinely wild, and where I think you should keep your skeptical instincts fully switched on. The core of the Tartaria idea rests on a specific and honestly fascinating observation, which is worth understanding even if you reject the grand conclusion built on top of it. Look at the great buildings of the 1800s, the colossal train stations, the domed courthouses, the World's Fair palaces, built of plaster and wood, we are told, and then torn down within a year or two. The ornate cathedrals and capitals covered in a density of detail that would bankrupt a modern city to reproduce. The theory asks a blunt question. How did societies with horse carts and hand tools, societies that were supposedly still muddy and half-built, produce architecture on this scale, at this level of ornament, this quickly? And why were so many of those spectacular fair buildings thrown up in a hurry only to be demolished almost immediately, as if someone were staging photographs of a world they were about to erase? The proposed answer is that these buildings were not built by the people who claimed them. They were inherited, left behind by the older civilization, and then redated, relabeled, and passed off as brand new construction by the society that moved into the ruins. And what happened to that older world? Here the theory reaches for its most dramatic image, the mud flood, the claim that some great catastrophe, or a whole series of them, buried the ground floors of older cities under a thick layer of earth. The theory points to buildings across Europe and North America whose original street-level entrances and windows now sit partly below the modern sidewalk, doors that vanish into the dirt, arched windows half swallowed by the ground. To conventional architects, this is ordinary. Cities rise over time. Streets are repaved. Ground level creeps steadily upward. Foundations settle. To the Tartaria believer, it is the visible tide line of a catastrophe that reset the world and handed the survivors a blank slate to rewrite. And here is where the theory becomes, of all things, an economic story. Because a blank slate is not just a cultural opportunity, it is a financial one. Think about what a true reset actually wipes clean. Debts, deeds, currencies, ledgers. Every record of who owed what to whom, and who owned which piece of ground. When the old world is buried, and the record is gone, someone gets to write the first entry in the new book. Someone gets to decide who starts rich and who starts with nothing. Whoever controls year one controls the entire ledger that flows from it. This is the part of the Tartaria idea that its more thoughtful followers actually care about, underneath the giants and the buried windows. It is a claim about power, that the real prize was never the buildings. It was the authority to declare a new beginning, to reset the accounts, and to hand the deeds of an inherited world to a chosen few while telling everyone else that this is simply how things have always been. You do not have to believe a single word about mudfloods to feel the pull of that idea, because it describes something that demonstrably does happen in history, just on smaller scales. Empires fall, and the victors rewrite the property maps. Wars end, and the treaties redraw who owns the coast. Currencies collapse, and whoever is holding the right assets at the right moment inherits the future. Control of the official past has always been an economic weapon, not just a scholarly hobby. The Tartaria theory simply takes that real mechanism and imagines it applied once, globally, at a scale so total that the reset itself was erased along with everything before it. So, where do the giants fit? Follow the logic all the way to its end. If there was an older, grander, physically larger world, then the people of that world might have been larger too, and the same authority that redated the buildings and buried the old ground floors would have every reason to make sure that oversized bones never went on public display. Because a single giant skeleton, standing in a glass case in the National Museum, would blow a hole in the accepted story that no plaster-fair building ever could. It would be undeniable, it would be measurable, and it would demand an explanation that the tidy timeline simply cannot give. That is the theory, and I have laid it out as strongly as its supporters would, because I think you deserve to hear the actual argument rather than a cartoon version of it. Now let me stand on the other side of the table, because that argument has serious problems, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Start with the giants themselves. Human height is not a matter of legend, it is a matter of biology. There are hard physical limits on how large a person can grow before the human skeleton simply cannot support its own weight. People with gigantism, a real and documented condition, do reach extraordinary heights, but they suffer terribly for it, and they do not form entire nations of 9-foot people. A world populated by giants is not merely unrecorded, it runs against the physics of bone and muscle. Then there are the photographs. If you go looking for pictures of these giant skeletons online, you will find plenty. And a great many of them are demonstrably fake, digital creations from photo editing contests, staged images, hoaxes made for fun and then passed around for years as the real thing. The existence of obvious fakes does not disprove the old written accounts, but it does poison the well. Once you know that some of the evidence was manufactured, you are forced to wonder about all of it, and the skeptics have a genuine trophy to point at. In 1869, workers digging a well in Cardiff, New York, unearthed what appeared to be a petrified 10-foot man. Crowds paid to see it. Newspapers ran wild. Learned men argued over whether it was a fossil or a statue. It turned out to be neither. It was a fraud, carved from a block of gypsum and buried the year before by a man who wanted to make a fool of the clergy and a fortune off the public. He succeeded at both. The Cardiff giant became one of the most famous hoaxes in American history, and it is exactly the kind of thing skeptics hold up to say, "See, this is what your giants really are, gullible crowds and a clever con man." And they are not wrong that the appetite for giants made people easy to fool. The question is whether that appetite explains every single case, or only the ones we already know were faked. And the disappearing bones have a much duller explanation than any conspiracy. 19th century excavation was crude and careless. Remains were dug up with picks, handled by untrained hands, exposed to open air, and shipped hundreds of miles in wooden crates on rough trains. Old bone that has survived underground for centuries can crumble to powder within weeks of being disturbed. Records were sloppy. Institutions were disorganized. Things got lost, mislabeled, discarded, or simply decayed into dust. You do not need a grand cover-up to explain a missing skeleton. You need only ordinary human incompetence, which history supplies in endless quantity. As for Tartary and the mud flood, the mainstream answers are, frankly, solid. The maps changed because knowledge improved. The half-buried windows exist because urban ground level genuinely does rise over the centuries. The grand old buildings were built by the people credited with them, using enormous amounts of underpaid human labor and a level of craftsmanship we simply chose to stop funding, not a level we somehow became incapable of. We did not forget how to carve stone. We decided it was too expensive. So on the evidence, the skeptics have the stronger hand. I want to be clear about that. If you forced me to bet, I would bet with them. But, and this is the but that keeps the whole thing alive, the reason a story like the 1919 dig still gets whispered 100 years later. The skeptical explanation requires you to believe that hundreds of separate witnesses across a century in different states, with different motives, all made the same specific mistake in the same specific way. That every doctor who measured an oversized jaw was fooled, that every surveyor who recorded a giant femur was careless, that every editor who printed double rows of teeth was lying. It is possible. Mass error is real, and human beings are excellent at seeing what they expect to see. But it asks a great deal, and the institution at the center of it has, at times, made itself very easy to distrust. When your answer to a mystery is that the evidence was never real, and also that the evidence can no longer be produced for inspection, you are asking the public to take a great deal on faith. Faith in the very authority whose entire job was to decide what counts as history in the first place. That is an enormous amount of power to hand to a single address in Washington, and history is full of examples of official truth turning out to be a good deal less than the whole truth. Here is what we can actually say with confidence, stripped of both the hype and the easy dismissal. We know the mounds were real, because thousands of them still stand and can be visited today. We know that a great many 19th century accounts describe oversized human remains inside them, because those accounts are printed in black and white in the surviving record. We know that the official verdict declared the giants a myth, and that almost none of the reported remains can be examined now. And we know that the same institution that delivered that verdict controlled the collection where the evidence would have been kept. What we cannot say, honestly, is what was inside those crates that left the ditch in 1919. Whether it was a fraud, a mistake, an ordinary skeleton misjudged in the heat of a strange discovery, or something that genuinely did not fit the story we were told and quietly ceased to exist because of it. That crew went back to digging their drainage ditch. The train carried its cargo east. The town told the story for a generation, then two, until the men who had held that bone in their own hands were themselves in the ground. And the crates, wherever they went, never came back. And notice what that missing evidence would have been worth, in the plainest terms. A confirmed giant would not have been a curiosity in a glass case, it would have been a wrecking ball. It would have forced a rewrite of who lived here first, of how old these lands really are, of which official timeline can be trusted and which one was assembled to be convenient. Whole libraries would have needed footnotes. Whole claims of ownership, of priority, of authority, would have wobbled. Evidence like that is not merely inconvenient to lose, it is expensive to keep. And things that are expensive to keep have a way of disappearing quietly, whether by conspiracy or by the simple, unglamorous neglect of institutions that would rather not deal with them. Either explanation ends in the same place. An empty drawer where a giant should be. Maybe there is nothing there. Maybe every giant is a tall tale, a trick of clay and excitement and cheap newsprint, and the reason the museum has nothing to show you is simply that there was never anything to show in the first place. Or maybe the most powerful thing a keeper of knowledge can ever do is not to tell you a lie. It is to decide, quietly, in a back room you will never see, which questions are allowed to have answers, and which ones simply disappear onto a train and are never spoken of again. The bone was longer than a man's forearm. Enough people held it in their hands to say so, and then it was gone. The men who lifted it kept the memory. The record itself has only ever kept a deliberate silence. What you choose to do with that is entirely up to you.